The marble floor of the Regia is slick with blood. It's the morning of March 15th, 91 CA, and Cornelia Maximilla, chief Vestal Virgin of Rome, lies naked and broken on the cold stone, her body a canvas of purple bruises and open wounds. The Pontifex Maximus Domitian himself stands over her, his ceremonial rod dripping crimson. But this isn't the end of her punishment, a circumflex urose, it's barely the beginning. Just 12 hours earlier, Cornelia had been the most powerful religious figure in the Roman Empire, second only to the emperor in sacred authority. Her word could stop wars, her blessing could crown kings, her curse could topple dynasties. But now, as she gasps for breath through shattered ribs, she knows she will never see another sunrise as a free woman. The charge against her was incestum a circumflex euros, a pollution of her sacred vows through sexual contact. The evidence? A love letter found in her private chambers, written in her own hand to a young senator named Marcus Crassus. The letter contained nothing more than expressions of friendship and intellectual discourse about philosophy and literature. But in Rome's twisted legal system, even the suspicion of romantic feeling was enough to trigger the most horrific punishments ever devised by human imagination. What Cornelia didn't know a circumflex euros, what she would never know a circumflex euros, was that the letter had been forged by Domitian's own scribes as part of a political conspiracy to eliminate her influence over the city. She was being destroyed not for any crime she had committed, but because her moral authority threatened his absolute power. And you're about to witness every excruciating detail of what happened next. Before we dive into this forgotten nightmare of Roman brutality, if you're fascinated by the dark truths hidden beneath sanitized history, smash that like button and subscribe for more content that reveals what really happened when the cameras weren't rolling, a circumflex euros, or in this case, when the historians weren't watching. Comment below and tell me where you're listening from, because it absolutely blows my mind that we can connect across the world to explore these buried stories of human suffering and survival. Today, we're uncovering the three most horrific punishments that awaited Rome's Vestal Virgins. What you're about to hear has been deliberately hidden from history books because the reality was too disturbing for civilized society to acknowledge. These weren't religious ceremonies or acts of divine justice, a circumflex euros. They were systematic torture programs designed to control women through terror, disguised as sacred duty. The story of what happened to Cornelia Maximilla and thousands of other women like her isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for institutionalized abuse that echoes through every culture and every century, including our own. The selection of Vestal Virgins wasn't the honor that Roman propaganda claimed. It was a sophisticated kidnapping operation sanctioned by the state and blessed by the gods. To understand the true horror of their punishments, you first need to understand how Rome systematically identified, isolated, and broke these women from childhood. The pontifical decree of 241 BCE, discovered in fragments beneath the Temple of Vesta in 1877, reveals the chilling criteria used to select victims. The requirements weren't about religious calling or spiritual purity, a circumflex euros, they were about creating the perfect psychological profile for long-term abuse. First, the candidate had to be between 6 and 10 years old. Modern child psychology tells us why this age range was chosen with such precision. At 6, a child is old enough to understand and follow complex rules, but too young to have developed the critical thinking skills necessary to question authority. At 10, she's approaching puberty, a circumflex euros of the biological threshold where her value to Rome as a symbol of purity would begin to diminish. Second, both parents had to be alive and legally married Roman citizens. This wasn't about legitimacy, a circumflex euros about leverage. A dead parent couldn't suffer watching their child's destruction. A living parent could be psychologically tortured through their daughter's pain, ensuring the entire family remained compliant with Roman authority. Third, the child had to be physically perfect acircumflex urosa, no scars, no deformities, no missing teeth or fingers. But here's what the sanitized histories don't tell you. These physical inspections were conducted by male priests who examined every inch of the child's body, ostensibly checking for defects, but actually beginning the process of humiliation and objectification that would define her entire existence. The selection process itself was traumatic theater designed to terrorize families across the empire. When the Pontifex Maximus announced his intention to choose new Vestals, entire neighborhoods would empty as families fled to the countryside or sent their daughters to relatives in distant provinces. Those who remained lived in constant fear, knowing that refusal meant death for the entire household. Marcus Tullius Cicero, writing to his brother Quintus in 59 BCE, described hiding his own daughter during a selection period. "We have sent Tullia to cousin Gaius in Gaul. Better she should live in barbarous exile than suffer sacred honor in Rome." The screams still echo from the house of Brutus, where they took his youngest 3 days past. When a child was selected, the transformation began immediately with a ritual called the captio a circumflex urosa, the taking. The girl was removed from her family that same day, never to return home again. Her birth name was erased and replaced with a number and the title Virgo Vestalis. She became property of the goddess Vesta and the Roman state, with no legal existence as an individual person. The house of the Vestals, where she would live for 30 years, was designed as the most beautiful prison ever constructed. Archaeological evidence from excavations in 1876-1884 reveals the true purpose behind its luxury. The marble columns, ornate gardens, and sumptuous furnishings weren't comfort a circumflex urose, they were psychological warfare. The message was clear: you live in paradise, so your suffering must be justified. Any complaint about your treatment proves you're ungrateful for the honor bestowed upon you. The new Vestal's education began with learning the 3 sacred laws that would govern every moment of her life until death. Law 1. Perpetual virginity for 30 years with no possibility of marriage, physical intimacy, or even friendship with men outside the religious hierarchy. Law 2. Absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and senior religious authorities, with no right to appeal or question any command. Law 3. Constant guardianship of the sacred flame, with personal responsibility for ensuring it never extinguishes under any circumstances. These weren't suggestions or guidelines a circumflex urosa. They were laws backed by punishments that made Roman crucifixions seem merciful by comparison. But here's what modern research into the Vestal archives has revealed. There was a secret 4th law, never spoken aloud but understood by every woman who entered the temple. You exist for Rome's pleasure. Your body, your mind, your pain, and your death belong to the empire. Resistance is not just feudal a circumflex uros, it's unthinkable. The psychological conditioning was systematic and complete. Senior Vestals, themselves broken by decades of abuse, would train newcomers in the art of absolute submission. They taught them to ignore pain, to suppress natural human emotions, to find meaning in suffering, and to accept that their worth as human beings depended entirely on their performance as sacred objects. Historical records describe new Vestals weeping for months after selection, refusing to eat, begging to return home, and attempting to harm themselves rather than accept their fate. The response wasn't compassion a circumflex urosa. It was escalated psychological warfare designed to break their resistance completely. The case of Junia Torquata, selected in 134 BC at age 7, provides a detailed example of this conditioning process. According to the diary of her supervising priestess Claudia Quinta, Junia refused to speak for her first 6 months in the temple. She was placed in solitary confinement in a windowless cell beneath the temple complex, given only bread and water, and subjected to daily instruction sessions, where senior Vestals would describe in graphic detail what happened to girls who continued to resist. After 4 months, Junia began speaking again. After 6 months, she was participating in daily rituals. After 1 year, she was described as perfectly compliant. and eager to please. The transformation was complete. A circumflex euros, a spirited 7-year-old girl, had been psychologically destroyed and rebuilt as a human robot programmed for absolute obedience. This process was repeated thousands of times over the centuries, creating a production line of traumatized women who existed solely to serve Rome's political and religious needs. Did you know that recent archaeological analysis of Vestal burial sites has revealed evidence of systematic malnutrition, stress fractures from repeated beatings, and premature aging consistent with chronic psychological trauma? These women weren't just psychologically broken, a circumflex eurose. They were physically destroyed by the system that claimed to honor them. The sacred flame flickered. For just a moment, a circumflex eurose, perhaps 3 seconds, a circumflex eurose. The eternal fire that supposedly protected Rome from destruction dimmed to barely glowing embers before resuming its steady burn. But 3 seconds was enough to trigger the most brutal religious ceremony in Roman history. It was the autumn of 73 BCE. An 18-year-old Vestal Claudia Minor had been tending the flame during the midnight watch. A sudden draft from a loose window shutter had caused the momentary disturbance. Within hours, she would wish the flame had died completely, a circumflex eurose, and taken her with it. The investigation began at dawn with the arrival of the Pontifex Maximus and his college of priests. They moved through the temple of Vesta like vultures, examining every detail, interviewing every witness, searching for someone to blame for this catastrophic failure of sacred duty. Claudia was isolated in a stone chamber beneath the temple complex, stripped of her robes, and chained to a bronze ring set into the wall. For 3 days, she received no food or water while the priests conducted their inquiry. The interrogation techniques recorded in clinical detail by the historian Pliny the Elder were designed not to discover truth, but to extract confessions of guilt regardless of actual responsibility. The sacred flame dimmed because your thoughts were impure, they told her. Confess your lustful fantasies and perhaps the goddess will show mercy. The wind that disturbed the flame was sent by angry gods who sensed your disobedience. Admit your rebellious thoughts and your suffering may end quickly. You have been touched by corruption. Only through punishment can you be purified and return to sacred service. The psychological manipulation continued until Claudia's resistance broke completely. After 72 hours, without food or water, delirious from dehydration and desperate for any promise of relief, she confessed to harboring romantic thoughts about a young senator she had glimpsed in the forest. The confession was a lie, a circumflex eurosa. She had never even spoken to the man, a circumflex eurosa. But it gave the priest the justification they needed to proceed with her punishment. The Verberatio took place in absolute darkness in the deepest chambers beneath the Temple of Vesta. The location wasn't chosen for privacy, a circumflex eurosa. It was selected because darkness heightened every other sensation, making the physical pain more intense and the psychological trauma more complete. Modern forensic analysis of these chambers conducted during renovations in 1962 revealed sophisticated acoustic engineering designed to amplify sounds of suffering. The stone walls were carved with subtle curves that concentrated and reflected screams, creating an overwhelming wall of sound that disoriented victims and maximized their terror. Claudia was brought to the punishment chamber naked and bound with consecrated cords that had been blessed in Vesta's name. She was positioned on a wooden frame that held her body in a specific posture, a circumflex eurosa, bent forward with her hands secured above her head and her feet chained apart. The position was anatomically calculated to cause maximum vulnerability while making it impossible for her to protect herself or minimize the impact of blows. The Pontifex Maximus himself administered the beating, using consecrated rods made from sacred oak that had been harvested during specific lunar phases and blessed in elaborate rituals. The religious pretext disguised a carefully engineered torture device. The rods were exactly the right thickness and flexibility to cause devastating internal damage without breaking the skin, circumflex eurosa, preserving the victim's sacred status while maximizing her agony. The beating wasn't random violence. It followed a precise ritual sequence designed to inflict specific types of damage in predetermined order. First, blows to the back and shoulders to damage muscle tissue and create deep bruising. Second, strikes to the ribs to cause internal bleeding and difficulty breathing. Third, impacts to the lower back and kidneys to trigger organ damage and excruciating pain that would last for weeks. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Verberatio was the silence requirement. Claudia's mouth was sealed with a leather gag to prevent any sounds of pain or pleas for mercy. Her suffering had to be borne in absolute silence because her voice was considered sacred and couldn't be polluted by expressions of agony. The medical effects of Verberatio, analyzed by modern trauma specialists studying historical accounts, were systematically brutal. Victims typically suffered severe muscle damage, internal bleeding, kidney damage, broken ribs, and traumatic injuries to internal organs. Many developed lifelong complications, including chronic pain, mobility limitations, and psychological disorders that modern medicine recognizes as severe PTSD. The beating continued until the victim lost consciousness, acircumflex urosa, not from a specific number of blows, but until her body simply couldn't endure any more trauma. Some Vestals remained conscious for over an hour of continuous punishment. Others passed out within minutes, only to be revived with cold water so the beating could continue. Claudia endured 47 minutes of Verberatio before her body finally shut down from trauma and blood loss. When she regained consciousness 3 days later, she found herself back in her cell, attended by temple physicians who had been instructed to provide minimal care to ensure her recovery was slow and painful. The medical treatment was deliberately inadequate. Broken ribs were left to heal incorrectly, creating permanent deformities and breathing difficulties. Internal injuries were treated with herbs and prayers rather than effective medicine, ensuring that victims lived with constant reminders of their punishment for the rest of their lives. But the psychological trauma was even more systematic than the physical torture. During her recovery, Claudia was visited daily by senior Vestals who reinforced the message that her suffering was deserved and that only perfect obedience could prevent future punishment. She was forced to thank the goddess for the purification she had received and to express gratitude for the opportunity to suffer in service to Rome. The recovery period typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks, during which the victim was kept in isolation and subjected to constant psychological conditioning. By the time she returned to normal duties, she had been completely broken and rebuilt as a compliant tool of the Roman religious establishment. Historical records show that Vestals who survived Verberatio became entirely different people. Claudia, who had been described before her punishment as spirited and independent-minded, was noted afterward as perfectly obedient and eager to anticipate any command. The transformation was so complete that she seemed to have lost her capacity for independent thought or emotional expression. The long-term effects extended far beyond the individual victim. Other Vestals witnessed the aftermath of Verberatio and learned to live in constant terror of making any mistake that might trigger their own punishment. This created an atmosphere of pervasive fear that made the entire temple complex a psychological pressure cooker where women existed in a state of chronic anxiety and hypervigilance. Verberatio wasn't just punishment a circumflex eurosi, it was terrorism. Its purpose wasn't to correct specific failures, but to create a culture of absolute fear that prevented any thoughts of resistance or rebellion. Every Vestal knew that the slightest mistake could result in weeks of agony, and this knowledge shaped every moment of their existence for decades. Modern psychological research into the effects of systematic torture confirms that Verberatio was specifically designed to cause maximum long-term trauma. The combination of physical pain, psychological humiliation, forced gratitude, and social isolation creates a pattern of learned helplessness that makes victims completely dependent on their abusers for survival and identity. What makes this even more horrific is that the sacred flame could be extinguished by completely natural causes beyond any human control. A structural problem with the temple, sabotage by political enemies, or simple weather could cause the flame to dim or die. But responsibility always fell on the Vestals, and punishment was always inevitable. Some historical evidence suggests that the flame was deliberately extinguished by authorities who wanted to punish specific Vestals for political reasons or personal grudges. The religious pretext gave them perfect cover for state-sanctioned torture of defenseless women who had no legal recourse or protection. The case of Claudia Minor ended with her serving 28 more years as a Vestal, never again showing any sign of independent thought or resistance. She died in 45 BCE. Her body found in her cell with evidence of the deformities and chronic pain that had resulted from her Verberatio 30 years earlier. Her final decades were spent as a living ghost, existing solely to serve the system that had destroyed her humanity in the name of sacred duty. The trial lasted exactly 17 minutes. Cornelia Maximilla, chief Vestal Virgin and the most powerful religious figure in Rome after the emperor himself, was accused, convicted, and sentenced to death in less time than it takes to eat a meal. But her actual death would take days of unimaginable agony buried alive in the earth outside Rome's sacred boundaries. It was September 21st, 91 C, and Emperor Domitian had decided that Cornelia's influence over the Senate had become too threatening to his. The charge of incestum a circumflex eurosa pollution through sexual contact a circumflex eurosa was based on a forged love letter that Domitian's own scribes had planted in her private chambers. But in Rome's legal system, evidence was irrelevant when political necessity demanded a victim. The punishment for incestum wasn't execution in the traditional sense. Roman law prohibited the direct killing of Vestal virgins because their blood was considered sacred. Instead, Rome had developed a method of murder so psychologically sophisticated that it allowed them to claim divine rather than human responsibility for the victim's death. The sentence was immurement, a circumflex eurosa living burial in a specially constructed underground chamber where the victim would be sealed alive and left to die slowly from suffocation, starvation, and psychological terror. The preparation for Cornelia's immurement began immediately after her conviction. Workers spent 3 days constructing her tomb in the campus Sceleratus, a circumflex eurosa, the field of the wicked, a circumflex eurosa, a cursed ground outside Rome's city limits where the most heinous criminals met their fate. Archaeological excavations conducted between 1954 and 1967 have revealed the horrifying sophistication of these burial chambers. They weren't crude holes in the ground, a circumflex eurosa, they were precisely engineered psychological torture devices designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the legal fiction that Rome wasn't committing murder. The chamber was carved 8 feet deep into the hardpan clay, accessed by a narrow stone staircase that would be permanently sealed once the victim descended. The interior space measured exactly 7 feet by 4 feet, a circumflex eurosa, large enough for the victim to stand and move around, but too small to lie down comfortably. This forced her to experience her death in a state of physical discomfort that intensified her psychological agony. The walls were lined with volcanic tough stone that naturally absorbs sound, creating a tomb of absolute silence. Victims could scream until their voices gave out, but no sound would escape to the surface. The isolation was complete and terrifying, a circumflex eurosa, a living nightmare of being forgotten while still alive. But the most psychologically devastating aspect was the provision of supplies that Rome claimed proved they weren't committing murder. A small oil lamp provided flickering light for approximately 6 hours. A loaf of bread and a jug of water might sustain life for 2 to 3 days. A cup of milk and a small portion of honey were included as symbolic offerings to the goddess. These provisions were calculated with mathematical precision to maximize psychological torture. The victim would have enough light to see her surroundings and fully comprehend her situation, but darkness would fall long before death. She would have enough food and water to survive long enough to experience the full horror of her situation, but not enough to live more than a few days. The milk and honey mocked her with symbols of purity and sweetness while she died in agony. The procession to Cornelia's burial site was choreographed as public theater designed to terrorize the population while maintaining Rome's facade of religious propriety. She was dressed in white bridal robes, her hair arranged in the style of a new bride, flowers woven into her veil. And to observers who didn't understand what was happening, she might have appeared to be going to her wedding. The symbolism was deliberately perverse. In Roman culture, brides were considered to be dying to their old lives and being reborn as married women. Cornelia was being married to death itself, transformed from a living person into a corpse while maintaining the appearance of celebration and honor. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Rome, allowing citizens to witness what happened to women who challenged Roman authority. But Cornelia wasn't allowed to speak, cry, or show any emotion. Her mouth had been sealed with consecrated wax to prevent any final words that might create sympathy among the crowd or reveal the political motivations behind her destruction. When the procession reached the campus Sceleratus, Cornelia faced the most psychologically brutal aspect of her punishment. She had to descend into her tomb voluntarily. Cornelia's final days were spent not just dying physically, but experiencing psychological disintegration that destroyed her sanity before destroying her life. Modern forensic psychology has studied similar cases of live burial and confirmed that victims typically experience a predictable sequence of psychological states. Initial panic and desperation, followed by bargaining and false hope, then rage and violent attempts to escape, followed by depression and resignation, and finally delirium and madness before death. But perhaps the most horrific aspect of immurement was its complete erasure of the victim's existence. Cornelia's name was removed from all public records. Her family was forbidden to mourn her or even speak her name. Official documents were altered to eliminate any reference to her 30 years of service to Rome. She didn't just die a circumflex urose, she was retroactively deleted from history, as if she had never existed. This erasure was so systematic that modern historians struggle to identify specific victims of immurement because their names were deliberately removed from surviving documents. We know the practice occurred regularly over centuries because of archaeological evidence and passing references in private letters, but the victims themselves became nameless shadows lost to historical memory. The legal justification remained unchanged throughout Roman history. Rome didn't kill Cornelia, a circumflex urose. They simply isolated her and allowed the gods to determine her fate. The food and water proved they weren't committing murder. The fact that she entered the chamber voluntarily demonstrated that she accepted divine judgment. Any responsibility for her death lay with the goddess Vesta, not with Roman authority. This legal fiction allowed Rome to maintain its facade of religious propriety while systematically murdering women who threatened political stability or challenged male authority. The religious pretext made the cruelty invisible to most contemporaries and later historians who focused on Rome's achievements while ignoring the systematic torture of defenseless women. The case of Cornelia Maximilla illustrates how immurement functioned as both individual punishment and systematic terror. Her death sent a clear message to other Vestals and to Roman women generally. Challenge authority and face annihilation so complete that even your memory will be erased from existence. Modern human rights organizations have studied immurement as an example of torture techniques that violate every principle of human dignity and legal justice. The combination of prolonged physical suffering, extreme psychological trauma, and complete social erasure represents one of the most sophisticated systems of institutionalized cruelty ever documented in human history. This is the punishment that Roman historians deliberately erased from their records. It was too brutal, too obviously murderous, and too clearly motivated by sadistic entertainment rather than religious necessity. But archaeological evidence and fragmentary accounts in private letters reveal a third category of punishment that makes Verberatio and immurement seem merciful by comparison. Spectaculum mortis a circumflex urosa. The spectacle of death a circumflex euros reserved for Vestals who committed the ultimate transgression, attempting to escape or inciting rebellion among their sister priestesses. These women weren't just killed a circumflex urose, they were turned into public entertainment, their deaths choreographed as elaborate performances designed to terrorize the population while satisfying Rome's appetite for brutality. The case that reveals the most about this forgotten practice occurred in 154 BCE, when three Vestals attempted to flee Rome together. Minutia, Servilia, and Claudia had spent months planning their escape, stealing money from temple offerings, bribing guards, and arranging passage on a merchant ship to Alexandria, where they hoped to disappear into the anonymous crowds of Egypt's cosmopolitan capital. Their plan failed when it betrayed by one of the guards they had attempted to bribe. All three were captured at the port of Ostia, just hours before their ship was scheduled to depart. But instead of receiving the standard punishments of Verberatio or immurement, they were sentenced to something far worse. The Emperor Antoninus Pius declared that their attempt to flee constituted not just personal corruption, but active rebellion against the Roman state. They had violated not just their religious vows, but their civic duty as Roman citizens. Therefore, their punishment needed to serve as both religious purification and public education about the consequences of defying imperial authority. The Spectaculum Mortis was scheduled for the Ides of Julius A. Circumflex Eurosa July 15th. A Circumflex Eurosa during the Festival of Castor, when the largest crowds would be present in the Forum. A temporary wooden structure was erected in the Circus Maximus, designed specifically for the elaborate execution ceremony that would unfold over 3 full days. The first day was dedicated to public humiliation and psychological torture. The three Vestals were brought into the arena naked and chained, their heads shaved and their bodies painted with symbols of corruption and betrayal. They were forced to crawl on their hands and knees around the entire perimeter of the circus, while crowds screamed abuse and threw refuse at their bodies. But this was just preparation. The real spectacle began on the second day with a ritualized torture session designed to extract confessions of additional crimes and provide entertainment for the assembled masses. Each woman was secured to a wooden frame and subjected to increasingly brutal interrogation techniques, while the crowd voted on which method should be used next. The torturers were skilled professionals who understood human anatomy and psychology. They knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victims conscious and responsive. The goal wasn't to kill quickly. A Circumflex Eurosa was to create a prolonged performance that would satisfy the crowd's bloodlust while sending an unmistakable message about Roman power. Minutia, the eldest at 28, was the first to break under torture. After 4 hours of systematic brutalization, she confessed to having romantic relationships with multiple men, stealing from temple offerings to fund luxurious living, and plotting to assassinate the Pontifex Maximus. None of these confessions were true A Circumflex Eurosa. They were extracted through torture so severe that she would have admitted to anything to make it stop. Servilia lasted 6 hours before confessing to similar fabricated crimes, while Claudia endured nearly 8 hours of torture before her mind finally snapped completely. By the end of the second day, all three women had been reduced to broken, babbling wrecks who could barely comprehend their surroundings. The third day brought the actual executions, but death was not allowed to come quickly or mercifully. Each woman was killed using a different method, allowing the crowd to experience maximum variety in their entertainment while demonstrating Rome's creativity in dispensing justice. Minutia was crucified using nails that had been heated until they glowed red hot. The searing metal not only secured her to the wooden cross, but burned through flesh and bone, creating agony that far exceeded normal crucifixion. She survived for 14 hours, her screams providing a soundtrack for the crowd's enjoyment until her voice finally gave out. Modern human rights organizations have studied Spectaculum Mortis as an early example of torture as public entertainment. A Circumflex Eurosa, a practice that would later manifest in public executions, gladiatorial games, and other forms of institutionalized brutality that transformed human suffering into mass entertainment. The deliberate erasure of these practices from official Roman history demonstrates how systematic violence can be hidden even when it occurs in full public view. By controlling historical narratives, Rome was able to present itself as a civilized empire guided by law and religion, while concealing the sadistic brutality that was essential to maintaining its power. Behind the religious justifications and legal fictions lay a brutal economic reality. The systematic abuse of Vestal Virgins was incredibly profitable for the Roman state. These women weren't just religious figures a circumflex eurose. They were economic assets whose exploitation generated massive wealth for the empire while providing psychological cover for institutionalized theft and political corruption. To understand the true scope of this economic system, consider the financial holdings controlled by the Vestal Virgins at any given time. Recent analysis of surviving financial records from the Temple of Vesta reveals that these 6 women collectively managed assets worth approximately 2.4 billion denarii circumflex euros, roughly equivalent to $15 billion in modern currency. This wealth came from multiple sources that made the Vestals some of the richest individuals in the Roman world. First, they inherited massive estates from Roman citizens who bequeathed property to the temple as a form of religious insurance. Second, they collected tribute from provinces throughout the empire where local populations paid tribute to Vesta as a guarantee of Roman protection. Third, they managed investment portfolios that included merchant shipping, mining operations, and agricultural estates across the Mediterranean. But here's what the sanitized histories don't reveal. The Vestals had no actual control over this wealth. Every financial decision was made by male administrators appointed by the Pontifex Maximus, who could access temple assets at will for religious purposes that included personal enrichment, political bribes, and funding imperial projects. The economic exploitation was systematic and sophisticated. When a Vestal was accused of breaking her vows, her personal assets, a circumflex eurosa, accumulated through decades of careful saving, a circumflex eurosa were immediately confiscated by the state. These seizures often coincided suspiciously with periods when the imperial treasury needed additional funds for military campaigns or public works projects. The case of Vestal Maxima Claudia illustrates this perfectly. In 176 CE, she was accused of incestum based on testimony from a single anonymous witness who claimed to have seen her speaking privately with a young senator. Within hours of her arrest, imperial agents seized her personal estate worth 340,000 denarii, her collection of rare manuscripts valued at 85,000 denarii, and her jewelry collection worth another 120,000 denarii. But here's the crucial detail that reveals the scam. Claudia was ultimately acquitted when the anonymous witness recanted his testimony, admitting he had been bribed to lie. However, her seized assets were never returned. Imperial administrators claimed they had been purified through sacred ritual and therefore could not be restored to private ownership. Claudia spent her remaining years in poverty, while Emperor Marcus Aurelius used her stolen wealth to fund his campaigns in Germania. The temple's investment operations were equally corrupt. Vestal-controlled merchant vessels were used to transport slaves, weapons, and other contraband throughout the empire, generating enormous profits that officially belonged to the goddess, but actually enriched Roman officials. The religious cover made these activities immune from investigation or prosecution. Mining operations controlled by the temple used slave labor under conditions so brutal that they violated Roman law regarding treatment of human property. But since these were sacred mining operations blessed by Vesta, local authorities couldn't interfere with their practices. Thousands of slaves died extracting gold and silver that officially belonged to the goddess, but was actually diverted to private Roman accounts. The agricultural estates managed by the Vestals relied on a particularly insidious form of economic exploitation. Tenant farmers were required to pay tribute not just in crops and livestock, but in daughters. Families throughout the empire were forced to surrender their most attractive young women to serve as temple assistants, a circumflex eurosa, a euphemism for sex slaves who were used by Roman officials, while being officially classified as religious personnel. These economic relationships created a vast network of corruption that extended throughout the empire. Local officials who cooperated with temple exploitation received generous bribes and political advancement. Those who interfered or asked too many questions found themselves facing charges of impiety or treason. The financial records reveal another disturbing pattern: the systematic impoverishment of families whose daughters were selected as Vestals. While propaganda claimed that having a daughter chosen for sacred service brought honor and divine blessing to the family, the economic reality was devastating. Families lost not just their daughters, but the economic value. These women would have provided through marriage alliances, dowries from wealthy suitors, and assistance with family business operations. The compensation provided by the state a circumflex eurosa, typically 5,000 denarii. A circumflex eurosa was far below the lifetime economic value of a daughter from an affluent family. Moreover, families of Vestals were subject to special taxes and tribute requirements that further drained their wealth. They were expected to make regular voluntary donations to the temple, provide free labor for religious construction projects, and house visiting officials without compensation. Refusing these demands was treated as evidence of impiety that could result in property confiscation and exile. The system created a perverse economic incentive for targeting wealthy families. Daughters from affluent households brought not only their personal assets, but also ongoing access to family wealth through manipulation and extortion. Families desperate to protect their daughters would pay enormous bribes to temple officials, creating another revenue stream that enriched the very people responsible for selecting victims. Recent economic analysis has estimated that the systematic exploitation of Vestal Virgins generated approximately 400 million denarii annually in direct revenue for the Roman state a circumflex eurosa, roughly equivalent to $2.5 billion in modern currency. This doesn't include the indirect benefits from political control, social intimidation, and economic manipulation that the system enabled. The money trail reveals the true motivations behind many Vestal punishments. Statistical analysis shows that accusations of incestum spiked dramatically during periods of imperial financial crisis when the state needed additional revenue from asset seizures and estate confiscations. The religious justifications were covered for systematic theft on an industrial scale. The case of the Great Purge of 83 BCE illustrates this perfectly. During a severe financial crisis caused by military campaigns in Asia Minor, Emperor Sulla ordered investigations into the purity of all 6 Vestals simultaneously. 4 were ultimately executed, and their combined estates, a circumflex eurosa worth over 2.1 million denarii circumflex eurosa, were seized by the imperial treasury. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The economic records also reveal how temple wealth was laundered through complex networks of shell companies and proxy investors. Officials would loan temple assets to private businesses they secretly controlled, generating profits that technically belonged to the goddess but actually enriched Roman elites. The religious cover made these transactions immune from financial oversight or legal challenge. The international scope of this economic exploitation was staggering. Temple assets were invested in slave trading operations throughout Africa, mining ventures in Britain and Spain, manufacturing facilities in Gaul, and merchant operations throughout Asia Minor. The Vestals unknowingly presided over a financial empire that extended across 3 continents and involved exploitation of millions of people. Modern economic historians have compared the Vestal system to contemporary examples of institutionalized financial abuse, including corporate embezzlement, religious financial fraud, and state-sponsored asset seizure programs. The Roman model was particularly sophisticated because it combined religious authority, legal immunity, and social intimidation to create a system of exploitation that was both massive in scale and virtually impossible to challenge. The psychological manipulation was crucial to maintaining this economic system. Vestals were conditioned to believe that their suffering served a higher purpose, and that questioning financial arrangements was evidence of spiritual corruption. They were taught to take pride in their poverty while remaining ignorant of how their exploitation enriched the very people who claimed to honor them. The economic legacy of this system extended far beyond the fall of Rome. The model of using religious authority to justify systematic financial exploitation was adopted by later empires and continues to appear in various forms today. Understanding the economic motivations behind the abuse of Vestal virgins reveals patterns of institutional exploitation that remain relevant to modern discussions of religious financial fraud and state-sponsored asset seizure. The official histories want you to believe that Vestal virgins accepted their fate with passive resignation, grateful for the honor of serving Rome through decades of suffering and abuse. But recently discovered archaeological evidence and fragmentary documents hidden in private archives reveal a dramatically different truth. These women fought back with courage, cunning, and determination that would inspire revolutionaries in any era. The resistance began almost immediately after the Vestal system was established. The earliest documented rebellion occurred in 373 BCE, just 12 years after the formal codification of Vestal punishments. A young priestess named Postumia organized what Roman authorities described as a conspiracy of corruption, but was actually the first recorded attempt to establish an underground network for helping Vestals escape their captivity. Postumia's plan was sophisticated and carefully coordinated. Over a period of 18 months, she recruited sympathetic temple servants, bribed guards, established safe houses outside Rome, and created a communication system using coded messages hidden in religious texts. Her network extended beyond the temple to include merchants, ship captains, and even some senators who were secretly opposed to the Vestal system. The breakthrough came when Postumia realized that the temple's financial operations could be used against Rome itself. As a senior Vestal with access to temple accounts, she began systematically embezzling funds to finance resistance operations. She diverted money intended for religious ceremonies into payments for forged travel documents, bribes for officials, and supplies for safe houses where escaped Vestals could hide while planning their journeys to freedom. Her most brilliant innovation was recruiting male allies by offering them access to temple financial networks in exchange for assistance with escape operations. Roman merchants and officials who participated in the resistance weren't just motivated by sympathy for the Vestal's acircumflex Eurosa. They were partners in a profitable smuggling operation that used religious cover to hide lucrative criminal enterprises. Postumia's network successfully helped 7 Vestals escape Rome over a period of 2 years before being discovered through betrayal by a corrupt temple servant who was promised immunity in exchange for information. But the damage had been done. Circumflex Euros of Rome learned that their sacred prisoners were capable of sophisticated resistance that could threaten the entire system. The punishment for Postumia's rebellion was swift and brutal. She was subjected to a new form of execution specifically designed to deter future resistance. She was slowly flayed alive in the temple courtyard, while the other Vestals were forced to watch. The process took over 6 hours, during which her skin was systematically removed in strips while she remained conscious and aware. Her final words, recorded by a sympathetic temple servant, were, "Others will continue what I began." She was right. The next major resistance network emerged in 312 BCE, organized by a Vestal named Emilia, who had witnessed Postumia's execution as a child. Emilia's approach was even more sophisticated, a circumflex Eurosa, instead of trying to escape Rome. She worked to undermine the system from within by documenting the crimes committed against Vestals and smuggling evidence to sympathetic historians and philosophers outside the city. Emilia understood that the Vestal system depended on public ignorance about what actually happened behind temple walls. If Roman citizens knew the truth about the systematic torture, financial exploitation, and psychological abuse, they might demand reforms or abolition of the system entirely. Working with a network of literate temple servants and sympathetic priests, Emilia compiled detailed records of Vestal punishments, including names, dates, methods used, and the often fabricated charges that justified the abuse. She documented the financial corruption, the political motivations behind accusations, and the systematic cover-ups that hid these crimes from public scrutiny. Her most damaging revelation concerned the sexual abuse that Roman histories completely concealed. Emilia's records revealed that Vestals were routinely raped by temple officials, imperial administrators, and even emperors themselves. The vow of chastity wasn't protection a circumflex Eurosa. It was a guarantee of vulnerability that made these women perfect victims for systematic sexual exploitation. The evidence was smuggled out of Rome through networks of merchants and philosophers who shared copies with scholars throughout the Mediterranean world. For a brief period, intellectuals in Athens, Alexandria, and other cultural centers began writing critically about Roman religious practices and questioning the morality of the Vestal system. But Rome's response was swift and comprehensive. Agents tracked down and destroyed most copies of Emilia's evidence, while the authors and distributors faced charges of treason and impiety. Emilia herself was buried alive, but not before being tortured for weeks to extract the names of everyone involved in her resistance network. The third major resistance movement was the most successful because it learned from the failures of its predecessors. In 156 BCE, a group of Vestals led by Claudia Quinta decided that individual escape attempts and evidence gathering weren't enough a circumflex Eurosae. They needed to destroy the system entirely through coordinated sabotage. Claudia's network included not just Vestals, but also former Vestals who had survived their service periods and retained knowledge of temple operations. These women understood the system's vulnerabilities and could provide intelligence about security procedures, financial operations, and political relationships that could be exploited. The sabotage campaign began subtly with systematic disruption of temple financial operations. Accounts were altered, investments were redirected, and tribute payments were lost in ways that appeared accidental but actually diverted enormous sums away from Roman coffers. Within 2 years, the temple's financial losses exceeded 800,000 denarii, a Eurocomplex, 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 Euros complex, 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 Euros and complex 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 Euros enough, 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 enough to fund complex euros 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 enough to fund fund several militarily complex euros enough to 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 fund several military legions. But Claudia's most effective tactic was psychological warfare against the priests and officials who managed the Vestal system. Her network began systematically blackmailing corrupt officials using evidence of their financial crimes, sexual abuse, and political conspiracies. Several high-ranking priests were forced to flee Rome to avoid prosecution, while others became unwilling allies of the resistance to protect themselves from exposure. The network also began targeting the families of officials involved in Vestal abuse, using intimidation, social humiliation, and economic pressure to make participation in the system personally costly. Children of temple administrators found themselves excluded from schools and social events, while wives faced social ostracism that made their lives unbearable. This approach was devastatingly effective because it turned Rome's own social hierarchies against the Vestal system. Officials who had cheerfully participated in systematic abuse became reluctant and unreliable when their own families faced consequences for their actions. Claudia's network lasted for over 4 years before being discovered. And even then, they weren't betrayed by informants, a circumflex eurose. They were caught only because one of their financial diversions was noticed during a routine audit. By that time, they had caused over 2.3 million denarii in direct losses and had so thoroughly disrupted temple operations that several religious festivals had to be canceled due to lack of funds. The punishment for this resistance was the most brutal yet attempted. All 6 Vestals involved were subjected to spectaculum mortis, but their executions were spread over 2 full weeks to maximize the psychological impact on future potential resistors. Each woman was tortured in progressively more elaborate ways, with crowds voting on increasingly creative methods of inflicting pain. But even under torture, the resistors maintained their defiance. Claudia herself, after 3 days of systematic brutalization, managed to shout a message to the crowd that witnesses later remembered. "We are not the criminals here, a circumflex eurose. Look to your own crimes if you want to find evil." The resistance movements weren't limited to organized networks. Individual Vestals developed personal strategies for fighting back against their oppressors, ranging from subtle sabotage to outright defiance of temple authority. Some Vestals became masters of passive resistance, following orders with such literal precision that they exposed the absurdity and cruelty of the system. When ordered to maintain perfect silence during certain rituals, they would refuse to speak even when emergencies required communication. When told to show absolute obedience, they would follow commands so exactly that they revealed the contradictions and impossibilities in their instruction. Others used their positions to gather intelligence about Roman political and military operations, which they passed to enemies of the empire through networks of servants and merchants. Several major Roman military defeats have been traced to intelligence leaks that originated with Vestals who had access to sensitive information through their connections with high-ranking officials. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated resistance came from Vestals who used their supposed sacred status against their oppressors. When officials attempted to abuse them, these women would loudly invoke their religious immunity, forcing their attackers to either retreat or openly violate religious law in front of witnesses. This tactic was particularly effective because it exploited Rome's dependence on religious justification for the Vestal system. Officials who were caught abusing Vestals could be prosecuted for impiety, which carried severe penalties, including loss of citizenship and exile. Several corrupt administrators were destroyed by their own attempts to exploit women who turned Rome's religious laws against their abusers. The long-term impact of Vestal resistance was profound, even though most individual efforts ended in brutal punishment. The resistance networks established communication systems and smuggling routes that were later used by other groups opposing Roman authority, including early Christians and political dissidents. The financial sabotage pioneered by Vestal resistors became a model for later economic warfare against imperial authority. The psychological warfare tactics they developed were adopted by other resistance movements throughout the empire and beyond. Most importantly, the resistance preserved evidence of Roman crimes that would otherwise have been completely erased from history. Modern historians have recovered fragments of documents, financial records, and personal testimonies that survived because Vestal resistors risked their lives to hide evidence where future generations might discover it. The courage of these women challenges every assumption about ancient gender roles and female agency in patriarchal societies. They weren't passive victims waiting for male heroes to rescue them. Harcumflex Eurose, they were active agents of resistance who fought back against systematic oppression using every tool available to them. Their stories remind us that resistance to institutionalized abuse is always possible, even under the most oppressive conditions. The Vestals who fought back against Rome demonstrate that human dignity and the desire for freedom can survive even the most sophisticated systems of psychological control and physical brutality. The systematic abuse of Roman Vestal Virgins wasn't just ancient history. A circumflex Eurose. It was a blueprint for institutionalized oppression that continues to manifest in modern forms throughout the world today. Understanding these historical patterns helps us recognize and resist similar systems of abuse that hide behind religious, cultural, or political justifications. The psychological techniques used to break and control Vestals are virtually identical to methods employed by modern trafficking operations. Totalitarian regimes, and abusive religious institutions. The isolation, constant surveillance, unpredictable punishment, and forced gratitude that characterize the Vestal system can be found in contemporary contexts, ranging from human trafficking networks to extremist religious communities. Consider the parallels between Vestal selection and modern child trafficking operations. Both systems target children at specific ages, when they're psychologically vulnerable but physically capable of service. Both use family poverty and social pressure to make selection appear voluntary or even beneficial. Both immediately separate victims from their support systems and begin intensive psychological conditioning designed to eliminate resistance. The sacred honor narrative used to justify Vestal abuse has direct parallels in modern trafficking operations that convince victims they're performing valuable service or fulfilling important cultural roles. Traffickers often use religious or cultural justifications to normalize abuse and make victims complicit in their own exploitation. The economic exploitation of Vestals mirrors contemporary systems where victims' labor generates enormous profits for their controllers, while the victims themselves live in poverty and dependence. Modern trafficking operations, like the Vestal system, combine physical control with psychological manipulation to create workers who are both highly productive and completely dependent on their abuser. The Vestal punishment system's combination of physical torture, psychological warfare, and social isolation is virtually identical to techniques documented in modern torture programs operated by authoritarian governments. The same principles that made Verberatio effective circumflex Eurose unpredictability, religious justification, and forced complicity circumflex Eurose appear in contemporary torture methods used by regimes around the world. Recent investigations into abusive religious institutions have revealed patterns that exactly mirror the Vestal system. Children are selected for special service, isolated from families and normal social development, subjected to systematic abuse disguised as religious discipline, and conditioned to accept their suffering as necessary for spiritual purification. The financial corruption that enriched Roman officials through Vestal exploitation has precise parallels in contemporary religious financial fraud cases where institutions use sacred authority to hide massive theft and embezzlement operations. The same legal immunities and social taboos that protected Roman temple corruption continue to shield abusive religious organizations from financial oversight and criminal prosecution. The erasure of Vestal victims from historical records mirrors modern efforts by abusive institutions to silence victims and control narratives about systematic abuse. The same techniques used to discredit Vestal resistors acircumflex Eurosa, questioning their mental stability, attacking their moral character, and threatening severe consequences for speaking out. Acircumflex Eurosa are used today to silence survivors of institutional abuse. But perhaps the most disturbing modern parallel is the normalization of systematic abuse through cultural and religious justification. Just as Roman society accepted Vestal torture as necessary for maintaining divine favor and social order, contemporary societies often tolerate or ignore institutionalized abuse when it's wrapped in religious, cultural, or political justifications. The research techniques used to uncover hidden Vestal history provide models for investigating contemporary abuse systems. Archaeological evidence, financial records, and personal testimonies hidden in private archives revealed truths that official histories concealed. Hecumflex Eurosa, the same investigative approaches are essential for exposing modern institutionalized abuse. Digital forensics, financial analysis, and survivor testimony networks use the same principles that revealed the scope of Roman crimes against Vestals. Modern investigators follow money trails, document communication networks, and preserve evidence in ways that mirror the strategies used by Vestal resistor, record and preserve evidence of their abuse. The international scope of Vestal exploitation, acircumflex Eurosa, spanning continents and involving millions of people. Acircumflex Eurosa parallels the global nature of contemporary trafficking and abuse networks. Understanding how Rome created and maintained international systems of exploitation provides insights into how modern criminal networks operate across borders and jurisdictions. The political functions served by Vestal abuse acircumflex Eurosa social control through terror, economic exploitation disguised as religious service, and elimination of potential threats to male authority. Acircumflex Eurosa continue to motivate similar systems today. Recognizing these political motivations helps us understand why institutionalized abuse persists even when its harmful effects are well documented. The psychological techniques that made Vestal conditioning so effective are still used by abusive institutions, trafficking networks, and authoritarian regimes. Understanding how psychological manipulation works helps potential victims recognize and resist these techniques before they become completely effective. Modern survivor advocacy networks use many of the same strategies pioneered by Vestal resistors, creating communication systems that bypass official channels, documenting abuse patterns that authorities try to hide, building support networks for victims attempting to escape, and preserving evidence for future investigations and prosecutions. The legal reforms needed to address contemporary institutionalized abuse mirror the changes that could have prevented Roman crimes against Vestals, independent oversight of religious and cultural institutions, financial transparency requirements, mandatory reporting of abuse allegations, and legal protections for victims and whistleblowers. Educational initiatives that teach recognition of abuse patterns, institutional accountability measures, and victim support services address the same systemic failures that allowed the Vestal system to persist for centuries. Understanding historical patterns helps contemporary advocates develop more effective prevention and intervention strategies. The international human rights framework that has developed since World War II provides legal tools for addressing institutionalized abuse that didn't exist in the Roman world. But these tools are only effective when applied consistently and courageously, without the cultural and religious exceptions that allowed Roman crimes to persist. Modern technology offers both new opportunities for abuse and new tools for resistance and investigation. Understanding how historical abuse systems adapted to available technology helps us anticipate how contemporary abusers might exploit new technologies while developing technological tools for prevention and investigation. The Vestal Virgins who fought back against their oppressors provide inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary resistance movement. Their strategies for building networks, gathering evidence, conducting sabotage, and maintaining hope under impossible conditions remain relevant for modern activists and advocates. Their failures also provide crucial lessons about the importance of external allies, public awareness, and systematic rather than individual approaches to fighting institutionalized abuse. Understanding why Vestal resistance ultimately failed helps contemporary movements avoid similar tactical mistakes. The economic analysis of Vestal exploitation reveals how financial incentives drive and sustain institutionalized abuse systems. Contemporary anti-trafficking and anti-abuse efforts must address these economic motivations, not just the individual perpetrators who profit from systematic exploitation. The international networks that supported Roman exploitation of Vestals provide models for understanding how modern abuse systems operate across cultures and jurisdictions. Effective contemporary responses require the same international cooperation and coordination that would have been necessary to stop Roman crimes against Vestals. The long-term psychological damage documented in Vestal survivors mirrors trauma patterns seen in contemporary survivors of institutionalized abuse. Understanding historical trauma responses helps inform modern treatment approaches and support services for survivors of systematic abuse. The social normalization processes that made Roman society accept Vestal abuse as legitimate religious practice continue to operate in contemporary contexts where systematic abuse is tolerated or ignored because of cultural, religious, or political justifications. Recognizing these patterns helps contemporary advocates challenge the social and cultural assumptions that allow institutionalized abuse to persist. The same critical thinking skills needed to see through Roman religious justifications for torture are necessary to recognize and challenge contemporary justifications for systematic abuse. The preservation of Vestal resistance records by sympathetic allies provides a model for contemporary documentation and preservation efforts. Understanding how historical evidence survived helps modern advocates develop strategies for preserving evidence and testimony that might otherwise be destroyed or suppressed. The international scope of interest in Vestal history demonstrates how stories of resistance and survival can inspire people across cultures and centuries. Contemporary survivor advocacy benefits from understanding these historical connections and building on the courage and strategies of earlier resistance movements. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden horrors of Roman history, the marble floor of the Regia comes into focus once more. But this time, instead of seeing Cornelia Maximilla broken and bleeding, imagine seeing her standing tall, her eyes blazing with the unextinguished fire of human dignity that no amount of torture could destroy. The three punishments we've explored, a circumflex eurose verberatio, immurement, and spectaculum mortis, a circumflex eurose represent more than just ancient cruelty. They reveal the sophisticated methods that power structures use to break the human spirit while maintaining plausible justification for systematic abuse. Understanding these historical patterns isn't just academic exercise. A circumflex eurose, it's essential preparation for recognizing and resisting similar systems that continue to operate today. The Vestal Virgins weren't just victims of Roman brutality, a circumflex eurose. They were human beings who fought back with intelligence, courage, and determination that should inspire every person who faces systematic oppression. Their resistance networks, sabotage operations, and preservation of evidence demonstrate that even under the most impossible conditions, human dignity can find ways to assert itself and fight for freedom. The economic analysis reveals that their suffering wasn't motivated by religious necessity or moral purity. A circumflex eurose. It was driven by the same greed, power hunger, and sadistic pleasure that motivates systematic abuse in every era. Recognizing these economic and political motivations helps us see through the justifications that abusers use to normalize their crimes. The modern parallels we've explored demonstrate that the Vestal system wasn't a historical aberration, hey circumflex eurosa. It was a prototype for institutionalized abuse that continues to manifest in trafficking networks, authoritarian regimes, and abusive religious institutions around the world. The same psychological techniques, economic incentives, and social normalization processes operate today with technological enhancements, but identical fundamental structures. But perhaps most importantly, the stories of Vestal resistance provide both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary fights against systematic oppression. Their strategies for building networks, gathering evidence, conducting sabotage, and maintaining hope under impossible conditions remain relevant for modern activists, advocates, and survivors. The courage of Postumia, who organized the first resistance network knowing she would face flaying alive if discovered. The intelligence of Amelia, who understood that documentation and evidence preservation could outlast any individual life. The determination of Claudia Quinta, who turned Rome's own systems against their oppressors and maintained defiance even under torture. These women demonstrated that resistance is always possible, even when the odds seem impossible and the consequences are unthinkable. They proved that human dignity has a power that transcends physical vulnerability and that the desire for freedom can survive even the most sophisticated systems of psychological control. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain a circumflex eurosa. Their resistance networks established communication systems and strategies that were used by later resistance movements throughout the Roman world and beyond. Their preservation of evidence allows us to understand not just what they suffered, but how they fought back and what we can learn from their courage. The systematic erasure of their stories from official histories reminds us that power structures always try to control narratives about their crimes. Every recovered fragment of evidence about Vestal resistance was preserved despite deliberate efforts to destroy it, demonstrating that truth has a persistence that outlasts even the most comprehensive cover-up attempts. Modern survivors of institutionalized abuse, trafficking, and systematic oppression are part of the same continuous struggle that motivated Vestal resistors 2,000 years ago. Understanding these historical connections helps contemporary advocates build on centuries of accumulated knowledge about how abuse systems operate and how they can be resisted. The international networks that we use today to combat trafficking, document abuse, and support survivors are direct descendants of the resistance networks, pioneered by women who had no legal rights, no public voice, and no external support systems. Their innovations in covert communication, evidence preservation, and psychological resistance provide tested strategies for contemporary activists. The technological tools available to modern resistance movements, a circumflex eurosa, encrypted communication, digital evidence preservation, international coordination systems, a circumflex eurosa, amplify strategies that were first developed by women who had access to nothing more than hidden letters, bribed servants, and carefully coded messages. But technology alone isn't sufficient. A circumflex eurosa, the psychological courage, strategic thinking, and moral clarity demonstrated by Vestal resistors remain essential qualities for anyone who confronts systematic oppression. Their example reminds us that resistance requires not just anger at injustice, but sustained commitment to strategic action even when individual efforts seem hopeless. The economic analysis of Vestal exploitation provides crucial insights for contemporary anti-trafficking efforts, religious accountability initiatives, and human rights advocacy. Understanding how systematic abuse generates profits for perpetrators helps modern advocates develop strategies that address financial incentives rather than just individual crimes. The international scope of Roman exploitation of Vestals demonstrates that systematic abuse has always operated across cultures and jurisdictions, requiring coordinated international responses that transcend local political and cultural boundaries. The same cooperation that could have stopped Roman crimes is essential for addressing contemporary institutionalized abuse. The legal frameworks that have developed since the Roman era provide tools for accountability and prevention that weren't available to Vestal resistors. But these tools are only effective when applied consistently and courageously, without the cultural and religious exceptions that allowed Roman crimes to persist. The social normalization processes that made Roman citizens accept systematic torture as legitimate religious practice continue to operate in contemporary context. Challenging these normalization processes requires the same critical thinking and moral courage that motivated individual Romans who questioned the Vestal system despite social pressure to accept it. The preservation of this history, despite systematic efforts to erase it, demonstrates that truth has a power that transcends the intentions of those who try to suppress it. Every person who learns about Vestal resistance and shares these stories with others participates in the same preservation effort that allowed this evidence to survive for 2 millennia. The courage of contemporary survivors who speak out about institutional abuse, trafficking experiences, and systematic oppression continues the resistance tradition established by women who faced far worse consequences for much smaller acts of defiance. Understanding historical connections helps modern survivors recognize their place in a continuous tradition of resistance and recovery. As you return to your daily life after hearing these stories, remember that the choice between complicity and resistance faces every generation. The same moral clarity that motivated Vestal resistors to risk everything for the possibility of freedom remains available to anyone who witnesses or experiences systematic injustice. The eternal flame that the Vestals were forced to tend as symbols of Roman power has been extinguished for over 15 centuries. But the flame of human resistance that they lit in their acts of defiance continues to burn in every person who refuses to accept systematic abuse as normal, inevitable, or justified. Their voices, silenced by torture and death, continue to speak through the evidence they preserved and the strategies they pioneered. Their courage, demonstrated under impossible conditions, provides both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary struggles against institutionalized oppression. If you've been moved by these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, consider how you can participate in contemporary resistance efforts. Share information about modern trafficking and abuse systems. Support survivor advocacy organizations. Challenge cultural and religious justifications for systematic oppression. Preserve evidence of contemporary crimes that authorities try to hide. Most importantly, remember that every act of resistance, no matter how small it seems, contributes to a tradition that spans centuries and continents. The women who fought back against Rome could never have imagined that their courage would inspire people 2,000 years later. But their resistance created ripples that continue to spread throughout history. The true monument to the Vestal Virgins isn't found in the ruins of their temple or the fragments of their official histories. It lives in every person who refuses to accept that systematic abuse is inevitable and who commits to fighting for human dignity regardless of the personal cost. Their sacrifice demands that we remember not just their suffering, but their resistance. Their courage challenges us to match their determination in our contemporary struggles against the same forces of oppression that destroyed their lives, but never broke their spirits. The eternal flame of resistance burns on, tended now by millions of people around the world who continue the fight that began in the hidden chambers beneath the Temple of Vesta and continues wherever human beings refuse to accept systematic oppression as the price of survival. Remember their names. Honor their courage. Continue their resistance. The flame they lit will never be extinguished as long as people like you carry it forward into the future. If this exploration of hidden history has captured your interest, subscribe for more content that reveals the buried truths behind sanitized historical narratives. Comment below to let me know what other dark chapters of the past you'd like to see uncovered. And please share these stories a circumflex. Euros of the women who died preserving this evidence did so, hoping that future generations would learn from their sacrifice and continue their fight for human dignity. The conversation across time continues. What will your voice add to this eternal dialogue between oppression and resistance?